Giovanni Martinelli woke up every morning at 5, just like he had done for the past 60 years. Even now, as Pope Leo XIV, leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, he couldn't shake the habit. His staff found it strange. Previous popes had slept in, taken their time with elaborate breakfast ceremonies, spent hours being dressed in ornate vestments, but not Giovanni. He would slip out of bed in his simple room, make his own coffee, and sit by the window, watching Rome wake up. The other cardinals didn't understand him. They whispered about it in the hallways of the Vatican. In the corners of grand ceremonies, over expensive wine, at private dinners. How could a man who grew up kneading dough in his father's tiny bakery in Naples possibly lead the Catholic Church? His hands were still rough from those years of work, his manner too plain, his speeches too simple. He didn't carry himself with the regal bearing they expected. He walked like a regular person, not like someone who held one of the most powerful positions in the world. When Giovanni had first arrived at the Vatican, as a young priest 40 years ago, he had been overwhelmed by the grandeur. The marble floors that stretched endlessly, the priceless art covering every wall, the elaborate rituals and ancient protocols. He remembered standing in St. Peter's Basilica that first day, staring up at Michelangelo's dome, and thinking about his father's bakery. The whole shop could have fit in one corner of this magnificent space. His father had worked 16-hour days to put food on the table and send Giovanni to seminary school. The old man had cried with pride the day his son was ordained. Giovanni had never forgotten where he came from. While other priests climbed the ranks by making the right connections, attending the right parties, saying the right things to the right people, Giovanni simply did his work. He studied theology deeply, wrote thoughtful papers that few people read, spent his free time visiting the sick in hospitals and the homeless in shelters. He didn't play the political games that consumed so many of his colleagues. That's probably why everyone was shocked when he was elected. Pope, the conclave had been deadlocked for days. The conservative cardinals wanted their candidate, the progressive ones wanted theirs, and nobody could get the required 2/3 majority. Giovanni wasn't anyone's first choice. He wasn't anyone's second choice either. But he was everyone's acceptable compromise, harmless, quiet, unlikely to rock the boat. They thought they could control him. The day of his election. Giovanni had stood on the balcony of St. Peter's overlooking the massive crowd below, and he had felt that old familiar anxiety creeping in. All those eyes looking up at him. All those expectations. He had given a short, simple speech, talking about service and humility and love. Some people in the crowd had cheered, but back inside, he had seen the looks on the cardinals' faces. Disappointment, barely concealed contempt. He wasn't impressive enough. He wasn't grand enough. He was just a baker's son playing dress-up in papal robes. Cardinal Benedetti had been the worst. A man from a wealthy Milan family, educated at the finest universities. With connections to politicians and business leaders across Europe, everything Giovanni was not. At Giovanni's first major address to the College of Cardinals 3 weeks after his election, Benedetti had sat in the front row with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. When Giovanni spoke about returning to the Church's mission of serving the poor, Benedetti had actually laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough for those around him to hear. After the address, Giovanni had walked through the halls and heard the whispers. They weren't even trying to be quiet about it. Did you hear him stumble over that Latin phrase? One cardinal said, "My grandmother could give a better speech," another replied. Giovanni had paused outside the room where a group of them had gathered, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to move. "The baker's boy is playing Pope," Benedetti's distinctive voice rang out. "Give him a few months, and he'll realize he's in over his head. Then we can get back to running things properly." Others had laughed. Giovanni had stood there in the hallway, his hand on the cold marble wall, feeling something twist in his chest. It wasn't anger exactly. It was deeper than that. A kind of profound sadness mixed with something else he couldn't quite name. He had walked back to his quarters without saying anything to anyone that night. Giovanni had sat in his private chapel for hours. He prayed, but he also thought about his father, who had faced mockery from wealthier bakers who looked down on his small shop, about his mother, who had cleaned houses for rich families and come home exhausted every night. about all the people he had known growing up who had been dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than because they didn't have money or status, or the right last name. He thought about why he had become a priest in the first place. It wasn't for power or prestige. It was because he believed, deeply and truly, in a message of love and service, in a vision of a church that lifted people up instead of keeping them down, in a faith that was about feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, speaking up for those who had no voice. The mockery continued over the following weeks. At formal dinners, Giovanni would see groups of cardinals huddled together, and they would fall silent when he approached. In meetings, his suggestions were met with patronizing nods before being ignored. When he insisted on walking in the Vatican gardens alone instead of being followed by an entourage, it was seen as another sign of his unsuitability. A proper pope doesn't wander around unattended like a common tourist. He overheard someone say. Giovanni tried to focus on his work. He met with bishops from around the world, listened to their concerns, studied the countless reports that crossed his desk daily. And that's when he started noticing things that troubled him. Financial reports that didn't add up. Missions in Africa that supposedly received millions in funding, but seemed to operate on almost nothing. Elaborate expenses for Vatican departments that couldn't be explained. He began asking questions. Quiet questions at first. Where did this money go? Why was this expense so high? Could someone explain these transfers? The responses were always smooth, always reasonable sounding, always designed to make him feel like he was bothering people with trivial details. These are complex matters, Holy Father, they would say with barely concealed impatience. Perhaps you should focus on spiritual matters and leave the administration to those who understand it. But Giovanni did understand it. He might have come from a simple background, but he wasn't stupid. He had spent years managing parish finances, overseeing diocesan budgets, and ensuring that every euro donated went where it was supposed to go. The numbers he was seeing in the Vatican didn't make sense, so he started digging deeper. Late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Giovanni would sit in his study, going through files. He began building a network of people he could trust. Those who seemed genuinely concerned about the church's mission rather than their own advancement. Younger priests, administrative staff who had been overlooked for promotion, people who had tried to report problems and been shut down. What he found made him sick to his stomach. The corruption went deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just mismanagement or inefficiency. It was deliberate theft on a massive scale. Money meant for orphanages, for schools, for feeding the hungry, was disappearing into private accounts, and some of the names involved were the very same people who mocked him every day. 3 months into his papacy, sitting in his simple room at dawn with a folder full of evidence on his lap, Giovanni made a decision. They thought he was weak. They thought he was just a simple man who would quietly disappear when things got difficult. They thought wrong. His father had once told him that the strength of bread comes from how long you knead it, how much pressure you apply, how patient you are with the process. Giovanni had been patient his whole life, but there comes a time when the bread is ready. When it's time to bring it out of the oven, he looked at the evidence in his hands and knew what he had to do. They wanted to play games. They wanted to mock him for his humble origins. Fine. But he was about to show them that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. The baker's son was. Done being patient, the scandal broke on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Giovanni was in his study when his secretary burst through the door, his face pale. Someone had leaked documents to the press. Not Giovanni's carefully gathered evidence, but other papers. Pieces of the puzzle that confirmed what he already knew. Major newspapers across Europe were running headlines about Vatican financial corruption. Millions of euros missing. Luxury apartments. Suspicious offshore accounts. Giovanni's phone started ringing immediately. Bishops calling from around the world, their voices panicked. What should they say? How should they respond? The media was having a field day. Every news channel was running stories about the scandal. Social media exploded with anger and disappointment. Catholics everywhere felt betrayed. Here was their church, their institution that preached about helping the poor. Behind the scenes, church leaders were apparently stealing money meant for charity. The pressure was enormous. Giovanni called an emergency consistory, a formal meeting of all the cardinals in Rome. They gathered in the apostolic palace, filling the ornate hall with red vestments and worried faces. The mood was tense. Some cardinals looked genuinely shocked and upset. Others looked defensive, their eyes darting around the room. Giovanni noticed Benedetti sitting near the front, his expression unreadable. Giovanni opened the meeting by acknowledging the crisis. He spoke calmly, saying they needed to get to the truth, needed to investigate thoroughly, needed to be transparent. He could see some cardinals nodding in agreement. But then Benedetti stood up. The cardinal from Milan was in his element. He was a skilled speaker, the kind of man who could command a room. His voice was smooth but carried an edge of accusation. He talked about the scandal, about how it was destroying the church's reputation, about how this had happened on someone's watch. And then he turned, looked directly at Giovanni, and said what everyone else was thinking but not saying. Holy Father, with all due respect, this corruption has flourished because of weak leadership. For 3 months, you have been more concerned with your walks in the garden than with managing the affairs of the church. You have ignored experienced advisors. You have refused to follow established protocols. And now we are paying the price. The room went silent. Cardinals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke against the Pope like this, not openly, not in front of everyone. But Benedetti wasn't finished. These scandals may have started before your papacy, but they have continued under your watch because you have failed to exercise proper authority. You come from a humble background, which is admirable, but running the church requires more than humility. It requires experience, knowledge, and strength. Qualities that, forgive me for saying, you seem to lack. Other cardinals began murmuring, some in agreement, others in shock at Benedetti's boldness. The cardinal pressed on, his voice growing stronger. Perhaps it would be best for the church if you considered stepping aside. For the good of all Catholics, for the preservation of our institution, maybe it's time to admit that this role is beyond your capabilities. Giovanni sat very still. He felt every eye in the room on him. This was it, the moment Benedetti had been building toward. The public humiliation. The call for resignation. Some of the cardinals who had always treated him with contempt were nodding. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The silence stretched out. When Giovanni finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Too quiet, some thought. A sign of defeat? These are serious accusations, he said, and this is a serious crisis. I need time to pray and reflect on the best path forward. He paused, looking around the room. I ask for 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, I will address this assembly again with my decision. Benedetti smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they had one. Other cardinals exchanged glances. 24 hours to decide if he would resign. That's what they heard. The weak pope, unable to handle the pressure. Asking for time to figure out how to gracefully step down. The meeting ended, and Giovanni walked back to his quarters alone. He didn't want his secretary, didn't want the usual attendants, just himself and his thoughts. Behind him, he could hear the explosion of conversation, cardinals clustering together, phones being pulled out. Within hours, the speculation would be everywhere. The Pope was considering resignation. The Vatican was in chaos. But Giovanni wasn't thinking about resignation. Back in his room, he pulled out the folders he had been compiling for weeks. The evidence he had gathered, the testimony from whistleblowers he had secretly protected, the financial records that told the real story. He had been waiting for the right moment, and Benedetti had just given it to him. He spent the evening making phone calls. Careful, strategic calls to people he trusted. Lawyers who specialized in financial crimes. Journalists who had been investigating Vatican finances independently. International auditors who had the expertise to understand complex money trails. By midnight, his plan was in place. But Giovanni also did something that surprised his staff. He called the Vatican's media office and told them he wanted tomorrow's consistory broadcast live. Not just to Vatican TV, but open to any media outlet that wanted to cover it. His communications director protested. This was internal church business. These things were never made public. Giovanni was firm. Tomorrow's session would be completely transparent. The next morning, Giovanni woke at his usual 5 o'clock hour. He made his coffee, sat by the window, and watched the sun rise over Rome. He thought about his father again. The old man had faced his own battles. Competitors who tried to drive him out of business, suppliers who tried to cheat him, customers who looked down on him. His father had never backed down when he knew he was right. He had stood his ground even when it was hard. At 9 o'clock, the cardinals assembled again. This time, television cameras lined at the back of the hall. Major news networks had sent crews. The cardinals looked surprised and uncomfortable. This was unprecedented. Benedetti sat in the same spot as yesterday, but his confident smile had faded slightly. Something about the cameras seemed to unsettle him. Giovanni stood at the podium. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. He had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. Even if he hadn't known exactly when it would come, he began speaking in a voice that was different from yesterday. Clearer, stronger, not louder, but carrying a weight that made people lean forward to listen. Yesterday, I was accused of weak leadership, of failing to address corruption in our church, of being unqualified for this role because of my humble background. He paused, looking directly at Benedetti. These accusations are correct in one sense. There has been corruption under my watch, but not because I was unaware of it, because I was investigating it. The room stirred. Cardinals began whispering. Giovanni continued. For the past 3 months, I have been quietly gathering evidence of systematic theft within the Vatican. Money meant for missions, for schools, for feeding the hungry, has been stolen. Not mismanaged, stolen. And today, I'm going to tell you exactly who did it. The whispers stopped. The room went completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. Giovanni began laying it out. Names, dates, amounts. He cited specific transfers, specific bank accounts, specific purchases. A villa in Tuscany bought with mission funds. An apartment in Paris paid for with money meant for African orphanages. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands holding millions that should have gone to disaster relief. He had documents projected on screens for everyone to see. Bank statements, email exchanges, recorded conversations. The evidence was overwhelming. 23 high-ranking officials were involved. 5 of them were cardinals. And sitting at the top of the list, with the most damning evidence of all, was Cardinal Benedetti. The cardinal from Milan had gone white. He started to stand, to protest, but Giovanni kept talking. Cardinal Benedetti purchased a €3 million villa using funds designated for orphanages in South America. The transaction was carefully hidden through multiple shell companies, but the trail is clear. He has also been receiving regular payments from a construction company that has received numerous Vatican contracts at inflated prices. Benedetti found his voice. This is outrageous. These accusations are baseless. I demand you demand nothing, Giovanni said, his voice cutting through the protest. As of this moment, you and the other officials I have named are suspended pending criminal investigation. The evidence has already been turned over to Italian authorities. You will have your chance to defend yourself in court. The room erupted. Cardinals jumping to their feet. Some shouting questions. Others trying to leave. Cameras capturing everything. But Giovanni wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am announcing immediate reforms. Every Vatican financial account will be open to independent international auditors. The secretive committees that have operated without oversight for decades are dissolved. A new transparency office will be established, led by lay experts, not clergy. People who have no vested interest in protecting the old system. He took a breath, then delivered his final announcement. And I am donating the PayPal apartments to be converted into housing for homeless families in Rome. I will live in the Vatican guest house. If I am to lead a church that serves the poor, I should live like someone who serves the poor. The chaos in the room intensified. Some cardinals were applauding. Others were red-faced with anger. Benedetti was being escorted out by Vatican security, still protesting his innocence. Cameras were capturing every moment. It's broadcasting it live around the world. Giovanni stood at the podium, watching it all unfold. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice had been steady. He had done it. Taken on the most powerful men in the Vatican. Exposed corruption that had festered for years. Put his entire papacy on the line. As he walked out of the hall later, his secretary caught up with him, looking shell-shocked. "Holy Father, do you realize what you've just done? The backlash will be enormous. There will be powerful people who want revenge."
Ow.
Giovanni nodded. He knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start. But for the first time since his election, he felt like he was doing what he was called to do. Not playing politics. Not maintaining the status quo. Actually leading. Actually fighting for what was right. Even when it was hard, the baker's son had just declared war on the most powerful institution in the world. And there was no going back now. The world exploded with reactions. Within minutes of Giovanni's broadcast ending, social media was on fire. News channels replayed his accusations over and over. Newspapers rushed to update their front pages. The Vatican phone lines were jammed with calls from journalists, bishops, and ordinary Catholics wanting to know what was happening. The responses were split right down the middle. Half the world seemed to be praising Giovanni's courage. Finally, someone willing to clean up the church. Finally, accountability. Finally, transparency. Young Catholics who had felt disillusioned with the institution suddenly had hope. Advocacy groups for abuse survivors applauded. Reform-minded bishops called to express their support, but the other half was furious. Traditional Catholic organizations released statements condemning what they called a reckless attack on church authority. Conservative bishops accused Giovanni of publicly humiliating the church. Wealthy donors threatened to stop their contributions, and inside the Vatican itself. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Cardinal Benedetti might have been suspended, but he had allies. Powerful allies who had their own reasons to fear Giovanni's investigations. That very afternoon, while Giovanni was meeting with the international auditors he had brought in, an emergency gathering of conservative cardinals was taking place in a private residence. Just outside Vatican City, there were about 30 of them. Some of the most influential men in the church. They spoke in urgent, angry tones about what had just happened. This wasn't just about Benedetti anymore. This was about power, about control, about a system they had spent decades building, in which Giovanni was threatening to tear down. He's making us look like criminals. One cardinal from Spain said, "Even those of us who have done nothing wrong are being painted with the same brush." "He's using the media like a weapon," another added. "Broadcasting internal church matters to the world. It's inappropriate. It's dangerous." They discussed their options. Could they force Giovanni to resign? Technically, a pope could only be removed if he resigned voluntarily or was deemed mentally unfit. The latter would require a complex process they weren't sure they could navigate. Could they simply refuse to cooperate with his reforms? Maybe, but that would make them look guilty. Someone suggested they needed to control the narrative. Start their own media campaign. Paint Giovanni as unstable, as someone who had been overwhelmed by the pressure of the job. Remind people of his humble background, his lack of experience with Vatican politics. Make it seem like he was in over his head and lashing out wildly. The campaign started that same evening. Friendly journalists began receiving calls from anonymous Vatican sources. Stories started appearing online and in conservative Catholic publications. Pope's mental state questioned after bizarre accusations. Vatican insiders worry about Holy Father's stability. His humble background proving too much for Pope Leo XIV? Giovanni saw the articles. His staff showed them to him, worried about how he would react. He read them carefully, his face giving away nothing. Then he set them aside and went back to work. He had expected this. Powerful people don't give up power without a fight. The next few days were brutal. The independent auditors Giovanni had brought in started their work, and what they found confirmed his worst fears. The corruption was even deeper than he had documented. It wasn't just individual theft. It was systematic. Entire departments had become vehicles for money laundering, charitable organizations that existed only on paper, construction projects that were billed at triple their actual cost, With the difference disappearing into private accounts, the auditors estimated that over the past decade, somewhere between 50 and 80 million euros had been stolen. Money that should have built schools, staffed clinics, fed hungry children, and supported missionaries working in dangerous areas. Instead, it had funded luxurious lifestyles for church officials who preached about poverty while living like kings. Giovanni felt physically sick reading the reports. He would sit in his simple room at night, looking at the numbers, and think about all the good that money could have done, all the lives that could have been changed, all the suffering that could have been prevented. But the resistance wasn't just political. It got personal. Giovanni started receiving death threats. Letters would arrive at his office with disturbing messages. "You will pay for this betrayal. Accidents happen to those who threaten God's church. Your time is limited." His security team took them seriously, increasing protection around him, but Giovanni refused to hide. He continued his daily walks in the Vatican gardens, though now with guards discreetly following. Some bishops openly defied him. 3 bishops from wealthy dioceses in the United States released a joint statement saying they would not implement his transparency reforms in their regions. A powerful archbishop in Germany suggested that Giovanni had exceeded his authority. Traditional Catholic groups organized protests outside the Vatican, calling for his resignation. The internal Vatican staff was split. Some of the longtime administrators, people who had built their careers within the old system, worked to slow down every reform Giovanni tried to implement. Documents would get lost. Meetings would be scheduled and then canceled. Simple requests would take weeks to be processed. They weren't openly rebelling, just making everything as difficult as possible. Giovanni's personal secretary, Father Antonio, had been with him for years, but even he was struggling. One evening, about 2 weeks after the broadcast, Antonio came to Giovanni's room looking exhausted and worried. "Holy Father, I need to speak with you honestly," Antonio said. "I believe in what you're trying to do. I really do. But the cost is enormous. The church is tearing itself apart. Major donors have withdrawn their support. Several bishops are talking about schism. There are rumors that entire groups might break away from Rome." Giovanni listened quietly. Antonio continued. "Maybe there's a way to accomplish your goals more gradually. Pull back on some of the more controversial reforms. Make peace with the moderate conservatives. You could still achieve transparency and accountability, just more slowly, in a way that doesn't tear everything apart." It was a reasonable suggestion, a practical suggestion, the kind of compromise that might have saved Giovanni's papacy from the chaos it was currently experiencing. Antonio waited for a response, hoping the Pope would see sense. Giovanni stood and walked to his window. Outside, he could see St. Peter's Square, empty in the late evening. He thought about all the people who had stood in that square over the centuries. Pilgrims coming to seek hope. Believers looking for spiritual guidance. The poor, the sick, the desperate, all coming to a church that was supposed to help them. When my father's bakery was struggling, Giovanni said quietly, he had a choice. He could cut costs by using cheaper flour, cheaper ingredients. Many bakers did. The customers couldn't really tell the difference, and it would have saved his business. But he refused. He said that if you're going to make bread, make real bread. Don't cheat people. Don't take shortcuts. He turned to face Antonio. "We're not making bread here. We're supposed to be serving God, serving people. How can we do that with a foundation built on lies and theft? How can we preach about morality while we're covering up corruption?" But the damage, Antonio started. The damage was already done, Giovanni interrupted. It was done when church leaders decided that protecting their power was more important than protecting their principles. "I'm not causing this crisis. I'm just finally admitting that it exists." Antonio looked like he wanted to argue more but didn't know what to say. Giovanni's mind was made up. The following Sunday, Giovanni gave a homily that was broadcast around the world. He spoke simply, directly, about what the church was supposed to be. About service. About truth. About the fact that institutions, even sacred ones, could lose their way. "Some people are saying I'm destroying the church," he said. But a church built on lies and corruption was already destroyed. We're not tearing down the church. We're trying to rebuild it on the foundation it should have had all along." He acknowledged the pain and division his actions were causing. He admitted it wasn't easy. But he was clear about one thing: there would be no going back. The reforms would continue. The investigations would continue. The transparency would continue. "I know I'm just a simple man from Naples," he said, his voice carrying across St. Peter's Basilica. "I know many of you think I'm not sophisticated enough for this role. You might be right. But I know the difference between right and wrong. And I know that staying silent about evil is the same as participating in it."
After the homily,
Giovanni felt drained. The pressure was constant. Every day brought new challenges, new attacks, new crises. His staff noticed that he looked older, more tired. The stress was taking its toll. That night, alone in his room, Giovanni wondered if he had made the right choice. Maybe Antonio was right. Maybe he was being too rigid, too uncompromising. Maybe a more experienced pope would have found a cleverer way to handle this. Maybe his humble background really did mean he wasn't qualified for this impossible job. He sat in the darkness, doubt creeping in like a cold fog. He had started this fight with such certainty, such conviction. But now, facing the reality of what it was costing, he felt the weight of it crushing down on him. People were suffering because of his decisions. The church was fracturing. And for what? Would anything really change? Or was he just making everything worse? For the first time since his election, Giovanni seriously considered the possibility that he might need to resign. Not because he was wrong, but because maybe he wasn't strong enough to see this through. Maybe the church needed someone with more political skill, more experience. Someone who could navigate these treacherous waters better than a simple baker's son. He sat there in the darkness for a long time, wrestling with doubts that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. The weight of the entire Catholic Church on his shoulders. And he wasn't sure he could carry it anymore. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more resistance, more pain. And Giovanni didn't know if he had the strength to face it. Outside his window, Rome slept. Inside, a simple man who had become pope sat alone in the dark. Wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life, Giovanni barely slept that night. When dawn came, he felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting an uphill battle and was starting to wonder if the hill was too steep. He went through his morning routine mechanically, made his coffee, sat by the window, but instead of his usual quiet reflection, his mind kept circling back to the same questions. Had he been too hasty? Too harsh? Too inflexible? The church was ancient, complex, full of traditions and protocols he didn't fully understand. Maybe trying to change it so quickly was naive. His schedule that day was packed with meetings. First, a video conference with bishops from South America, who were angry about the financial investigations affecting their regions. Then a sit-down with Vatican lawyers discussing the criminal cases against the suspended officials. After that, a meeting with his communications team about the ongoing media crisis. Every meeting was difficult. The South American bishops accused him of not trusting them, of treating them like criminals when they had done nothing wrong. The lawyers warned him that some of the suspended officials were preparing to sue the Vatican, claiming wrongful dismissal. The communications team showed him poll numbers indicating that while young Catholics supported him, older traditional Catholics were deeply upset, and overall church attendance was dropping. By mid-afternoon, Giovanni's head was pounding. He canceled his remaining meetings and went to his private chapel to pray. But even prayer felt hollow. He knelt there for an hour, trying to find clarity, trying to feel the certainty that had driven him to act in the first place. Instead, he just felt tired and alone. Father Antonio found him there. The secretary looked worried. "Holy Father, there's something you need to see." Antonio handed him a tablet showing various news websites. More articles attacking Giovanni, but these were different. More coordinated, more personal. They included details about his family, his past, his time as a young priest. Nothing scandalous, but the message was clear. They were investigating him now, looking for anything they could use. They're trying to destroy you, Antonio said quietly. If you continue on this path, they won't stop until they've torn apart every aspect of your life. Giovanni looked at the screen, seeing photos of his late parents, of the small bakery where he'd grown up, all being used to paint him as unqualified, as someone who didn't belong in the Vatican. He felt a wave of protectiveness for his family's memory. Did he have the right to drag them into this? That evening, there was a scheduled public appearance. A weekly audience with pilgrims in St. Peter's Square. Giovanni's staff suggested canceling it given the current climate, but Giovanni insisted on going. Maybe seeing real people, ordinary Catholics, would help him remember why this mattered. But when he appeared on the balcony overlooking the square, he was shocked by what he saw. The crowd was much smaller than usual, and it was divided. Some sections held signs supporting him. Truth and justice, we stand with Pope Leo. But other sections held opposing signs. Tradition. Not revolution, respect the church. Security had separated the two groups to prevent confrontation, but the tension was obvious. People were shouting at each other. Giovanni could see arguments breaking out. Even St. Peter's Square, which was supposed to be a place of peace and unity, had become a battleground. He gave a brief, subdued blessing and retreated back inside. He felt like he was watching everything fall apart. The unity of the church, the faith of believers, the very foundation of what he had dedicated his life to. And it was happening because of choices he had made. Back in his quarters, Giovanni sat in the darkness again. This time, he was seriously drafting a resignation letter in his mind. He would say that he had tried to serve, had done what he thought was right, but that the church needed someone better suited to lead it through these troubles. Someone with more experience. Someone who could build bridges instead of burning them. He didn't write it down yet, but he was close. So close to giving up, the next morning was Sunday. Giovanni woke early as always, but he felt heavy, defeated. He went to the window to watch the sunrise, expecting another difficult day. What he saw instead made him stop completely. St. Peter's Square was filling with people. Lots of people. More than he'd seen in weeks. They weren't there for a scheduled event. They were just arriving, steadily, continuously, carrying signs and flowers and candles. Giovanni watched, confused, as thousands upon thousands of people streamed into the square. His phone started ringing. Father Antonio, breathless with excitement. Holy Father, you need to come see this. People are coming from everywhere. They're gathering to show support for you. Giovanni got dressed quickly and went down to a window that gave him a better view. The square was packed now. Tens of thousands of people, and more, arriving every minute. They came from nearby Rome, but also from farther away. Buses were pulling up, letting out groups who had traveled through the night. The crowd was diverse, young and old, rich and poor. People of all backgrounds. Many carried signs, but these weren't angry political slogans. They were personal messages. Thank you for telling the truth. You give us hope. We believe in real change. A church for the people. Some people held photos of loved ones who had been hurt by church corruption. Others held images of missionaries and aid workers who had done good work despite the system. Giovanni's staff gathered around him, watching in amazement as the crowd continued to grow. By mid-morning, estimates put the number at over 100,000 people. They weren't there because they had been organized by some group or political movement. They had come spontaneously, individually. Because they wanted to, there were survivors of clergy abuse, holding signs that said justice at last. There were poor families who had been helped by honest priests working in underfunded missions. There were young people who had almost left the church entirely, but now felt hope that it could be better. There were longtime Catholics who were tired of watching their church drift from its core mission. The crowd was peaceful. They weren't shouting or demanding. They were simply present, standing witness, showing solidarity. Some prayed. Some sang hymns. Some just stood quietly, their presence itself a statement. Giovanni stood at the window, tears running down his face. He had felt so alone, so isolated in his struggle. He had thought he was fighting this battle by himself against the powerful forces within the church. But here, filling St. Peter's Square, were thousands of people who believed in what he was trying to do. Father Antonio stood beside him. "Holy Father, they're asking if you'll come speak to them." Giovanni nodded, wiping his eyes. He walked down to the balcony overlooking the square. When he appeared, the crowd erupted in cheers. Not the formal, polite applause of typical PayPal audiences. Real cheers, emotional and heartfelt. People crying. People hugging each other. People holding up their phones to capture the moment. Giovanni raised his hand for quiet. When the crowd settled, he spoke simply. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice breaking slightly. "These past weeks have been difficult. There have been moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. When I wondered if I should just give up and step aside." The crowd shouted no, in unison. Giovanni smiled slightly. "But seeing all of you here today reminds me why this matters. The church isn't about buildings or institutions or power. It's about people. People who believe in something bigger than themselves. People who want their faith community to actually live up to its values." He paused, looking out over the massive crowd. "I'm not a perfect leader. I make mistakes. I'm just a simple man who's trying his best. But I promise you this, as long as I have breath, I will keep fighting for a church that serves rather than takes, that protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful, that chooses truth over comfort." The crowd roared its approval. Giovanni stood there for a long moment, letting it wash over him. Then he gave a blessing and went back inside. But the crowd didn't leave. They stayed all day. News channels broadcast images of the gathering around the world. Social media exploded with photos and videos. The hashtag We Stand With Leo trended globally. Catholics in other countries began organizing their own gatherings in solidarity. The response inside the Vatican was immediate. The bishops who had been resisting Giovanni's reforms suddenly became much more cooperative. The cardinals who had been whispering about forcing him out went quiet. Even some of the conservative opposition softened their stance. The message was clear. If they pushed too hard against Giovanni now, they would be fighting not just him, but a significant portion of the global Catholic population. Over the next few days, more support rolled in. Progressive bishops from around the world released a joint letter backing Giovanni's reforms. Several national bishops' conferences announced they would implement the transparency measures in their regions. Donations to legitimate charitable missions actually increased as people felt more confident their money would be used properly. The criminal investigations continued. Cardinal Benedetti's trial date was set. Other suspended officials were being prosecuted. Some chose to cooperate, providing even more evidence of corruption in exchange for lighter sentences. The full scope of the scandal was still emerging, but at least now it was being addressed openly rather than hidden. Giovanni threw himself back into his work with renewed energy. He expanded the reforms, establishing new oversight committees with significant lay participation. He invited women into senior administrative roles for the first time, arguing that the church had been weakened by excluding half of humanity from leadership. He convened a special synod to discuss long-term structural reforms. Not everyone was happy. The traditionalist opposition didn't disappear, but they were forced to operate more carefully now. The spontaneous gathering in St. Peter's Square had changed the dynamic. Giovanni had popular support, and that gave him power that even his opponents had to respect. One evening, a few weeks after that transformative Sunday, Giovanni sat in his room reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the night he had almost resigned, the moment of deepest doubt, when he had felt completely alone and overwhelmed. Father Antonio came to check on him and found him smiling. "What are you thinking about, Holy Father?" Giovanni looked up. "I'm thinking about bread again. My father used to say that sometimes the dough doesn't rise the way you expect. Sometimes it seems like it's not working at all. But if the ingredients are good and you're patient, it finds its way." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful square below. I almost gave up. I was ready to walk away. But then I remembered I wasn't doing this alone. There are millions of good people out there who want the same things I want, who believe in the same things I believe in. I just had to trust that they were there, even when I couldn't see them. Antonio nodded. They were always there, Holy Father. They just needed to know you were fighting for them. Giovanni smiled. And I needed to know they were with me. We saved each other. Outside, Rome continued its eternal rhythm. Inside the Vatican, a simple man from Naples had found his strength again. The fight wasn't over. It would probably never be over. But now he knew he didn't have to fight it alone. 5 years passed. 5 years that transformed not just the Vatican, but the entire Catholic Church's relationship with the world. Looking back, people would mark Giovanni's live broadcast confrontation with Cardinal Benedetti as the turning point, the moment when everything changed. But the real transformation happened slowly, deliberately. Through thousands of small decisions and reforms that accumulated into something revolutionary. The criminal trials had concluded. Cardinal Benedetti was convicted of fraud and money laundering. He was defrocked, stripped of all his titles and privileges, and sentenced to 7 years in an Italian prison. The sight of a cardinal in prison clothes had shocked many Catholics, but Giovanni saw it as necessary. Justice couldn't have exceptions for the powerful. 11 other high-ranking officials also faced convictions. Some served time. Others received house arrest. All were removed from their positions permanently. But Giovanni knew that punishing the guilty was only half the battle. The harder work was rebuilding systems so the corruption couldn't happen again. The independent auditors he had brought in didn't just investigate the past. They helped design new financial structures for the future. Every diocese, every Vatican department, every charitable organization now had to publish detailed financial reports quarterly. The reports were public, available online for anyone to examine. A new Vatican constitution for financial affairs was established. It required multiple levels of approval for large expenditures, mandatory rotation of financial officers to prevent entrenchment, and whistleblower protections for anyone who reported suspicious activity. The secretive committees that had operated in the shadows for decades were replaced with transparent boards that included lay experts from finance, law, and nonprofit management. The changes went beyond finances. Giovanni convened 3 special synods during those 5 years, bringing together bishops, theologians, laypeople, and even outside experts to discuss how the Church should operate in the modern world. The discussions were difficult, often contentious, but they were open. For the first time in many Catholics' memory, difficult questions weren't being swept under the rug. One of the most controversial moves was Giovanni's decision to include women in senior Vatican positions. Not as clergy, that remained a theological issue beyond what he felt he could change, but as administrators, advisors, and decision-makers. He appointed the first woman to head a Vatican department, choosing an Italian lawyer known for her expertise in international human rights. Conservative bishops protested, but Giovanni was firm. The Church couldn't claim to serve all of humanity while excluding half of it from leadership roles. He also established a permanent commission for clergy abuse survivors. With real power and resources, not a symbolic gesture, but an actual body that investigated claims, compensated victims, and worked to prevent future abuse. Some survivors became official advisors to the Vatican, their lived experiences shaping policy in ways that had never happened before. It was painful work, forcing the Church to confront its worst failures. But Giovanni believed it was necessary. The Vatican itself changed physically. The papal apartments that Giovanni had vacated were converted into transitional housing for homeless families in Rome. About a dozen families cycled through each year, receiving not just shelter, but job training, counseling, and help getting back on their feet. Giovanni continued living in the simple guest house, a room no larger than what many of his priests lived in around the world. He used the Vatican gardens differently too. Parts of them were open to the public on weekends. People could walk the same paths the Pope walked, sit on the same benches. It was a small thing, but symbolic. The Vatican belonged to all Catholics, not just the privileged few who worked there. Not everyone was happy with the changes. There were still conservative bishops who fought against the reforms. A small but vocal group of traditionalist Catholics actually did break away, forming their own splintered church that claimed to represent true Catholicism. It was painful. But Giovanni accepted it as the cost of change. You couldn't move forward if you were constantly being pulled backward by those who refused to accept any change at all. The financial audits had recovered about 40 million euros of the stolen funds. The money was redirected to the charitable purposes it had been meant for originally. New schools were built in Africa. Medical clinics were established in South America. Disaster relief operations were properly funded. Giovanni made a point of visiting some of these projects personally, wanting to see where the recovered money was actually going. One visit stood out. He traveled to a small village in Kenya, where a school had finally been completed after years of being stalled due to lack of funds. Funds that, it turned out, had been sitting in Cardinal Benedetti's offshore accounts the whole time. Giovanni walked through the classrooms, met the children, talked with the teachers. An older woman, the school's principal, took his hand and squeezed it tightly. "You gave these children their future back," she said, tears in her eyes. "Some people say you hurt the church, but you saved these children. You saved us." Giovanni thought about that moment often. That's what it had all been for. Not politics. Not power. Just making sure that the church actually did what it claimed to do: serve the vulnerable and lift up the poor. The media narrative around Giovanni shifted over those 5 years. Early on, he had been portrayed as either a crusading hero or a dangerous radical, depending on which outlet was covering him. But as time passed and the reforms proved effective, even his critics had to acknowledge that he had fundamentally changed the Vatican for the better. Corruption hadn't been eliminated entirely. It was probably impossible in any large institution, but it was no longer systematic. It was no longer accepted. And when it was discovered, it was prosecuted.